A missing letter, a silenced woman, a village secret sealed in parchment. Welcome to Crimson Ledger. I am your host, Bernard. Tell me, where in the world are you listening from today? Your comments always brighten my day. Don't hold back. Let's begin. The bell above the church door let out a reluctant chime as the last of the parishioners stepped into St. Mildred's for Thursday evening choir practice. Outside, dusk settled gently over the village of Dibley Wick, painting the rooftops in honeyed grey and casting long shadows across the rose beds bordering the churchyard. Within, the choir members, nearly a dozen voices strong, murmured pleasantries as they took their usual places in the pews, some unwrapping peppermints, others leafing through their hymnals. Miss Marple, sitting quietly in the back row, held a navy leather-bound hymnal open on her lap, though she rarely sang above a whisper. It was her custom to attend not for the music, which she found slightly uneven, but for the view, socially speaking. In her experience, the choir was a rather good place to observe human nature, the flirtations between altos and tenors, the occasional envy over a solo, the whispered remarks about Mrs. Bevington's ever-larger hats. On this particular Thursday, however, the harmonies were fated never to begin. Just as Mr. Calthrop, the choir master, was clearing his throat to lead them into the opening notes of "Praise My Soul," the side door burst open, and in stumbled young Daniel Bray, the village postman, red-faced, breathless, and still clutching his cap. "Pardon, Reverend," he gasped, nodding to the vicar in the front pew. "I found something behind the altar rail, sir. I think it's a dead man." The words fell into the chapel with a weight that crushed all conversation. Mr. Calthrop dropped his tuning fork. Mrs. Broadley let out a sound somewhere between a gasp and a sneeze. Someone's hymnal slipped from trembling hands. Miss Marple alone did not stir. Her eyes had narrowed slightly, like a bird's, and she shut her hymnal without looking down. "Well," she said softly, "that would explain the curate's odd expression this morning." Within minutes, the church had been transformed from a place of praise to a scene of alarm. Reverend Pym, pallid and shaken, led the way behind the pulpit, where a small wooden door opened into the vestry and the altar space beyond. There, just as Daniel Bray had described, lay the body of a man, partially concealed behind the crimson curtain of the sanctuary rail, his head resting at an unnatural angle against the carved stone. He was not from the village. That much was immediately evident. His suit, while travel-worn, was of excellent cut. A silk cravat lay askew at the neck, and a traveling coat, expensive, foreign, was folded carefully on the floor beside him. In his hand was a hymnal, identical to those in the pews, save for one detail. "A bookmark," muttered Inspector Darnley, who had been summoned from nearby Muchwood-on-Lyre. He crouched beside the corpse, squinting as he removed the narrow object nestled between the hymnal's pages. Hollow. It was, indeed, no ordinary bookmark. Rather, it was a wooden sliver, the size of a finger, expertly carved to appear solid, but which opened at the side like a snuff-box. Inside, folded in quarters, was a scrap of stiff parchment, blank. "Well," said the inspector, rising, "that's either nothing, or it's something devilishly clever." Miss Marple had moved no closer than the back pew. She did not need to. Her attention had fixed instead on the reactions of the living. Mrs. Featherington, normally quick to moral outrage, had gone uncharacteristically silent. Old Mr. Willers, the church warden, was biting the inside of his cheek, a habit he reserved for matters involving money. And young Alice Calthrop, daughter of the choir master, was shaking, not with fear, but with what Miss Marple suspected was suppressed recognition. She would, of course, say nothing yet. Inspector Darnley, a brisk man with well-shined boots and little tolerance for dithering, turned to the group. "Right then, I'll need statements from each of you. No one is to leave the village tonight without my say-so. Reverend Pym, please accompany me to the vicarage. There'll be records of recent visitors, I expect." The Reverend nodded dumbly and followed. The rest were left in the pews, unsure whether to talk or whisper or wait. Miss Marple leaned slightly toward Mrs. Brodie, who was fanning herself with the church bulletin. "Do you recall," she asked in her soft, almost imperceptible voice, "whether the choir cupboard has been disturbed? I seem to recall the key being missing last Sunday." Mrs. Brodie blinked. "Why, I wouldn't know, but I dare say old Willers would. He's always fussing about the inventory." "Quite so," said Miss Marple, settling back with an air of quiet finality. "Then perhaps we shall begin there." Outside the church, the bells of Dibley Wick continued to toll their hourly refrain. But inside, beneath the silent gaze of stone angels and stained glass saints, something darker had been set in motion. The man in the sanctuary was dead. The village had a mystery, and Miss Marple had already begun to solve it, though, as ever, no one had thought to ask her. Not yet. By morning, the village of Dibley Wick had rearranged itself into a series of private suspicions and public performances. As fog clung to the hedgerows and dew silvered the lawns, the death at St. Mildred's passed from alarming incident to social currency. It was not just that a man had died, but that he had died in church. A fact that lent an almost theatrical gravity to the affair, as though it were not simply a death, but a message. At the High Street tea shop, Mrs. Featherington clutched her cup with the same tight grip she'd used to clutch her Bible the night before. Her voice, habitually pitched just below scandal, rose a touch as she confided in the woman beside her. "Foreign," she whispered. "You could tell. That coat, those boots. He didn't belong. I came here to hide something, I'd wager. Drugs or gold, or something worse." 2 tables over, Mr. Willers disagreed. Not with Mrs. Featherington directly, of course, but in volume and tone carefully calibrated to carry across the room. "If you ask me," he declared to no one in particular, "it was a robbery gone wrong. A stranger wanders into the vestry, thinking it's just another country church. Didn't expect the lad to come in during practice. Surprised, he drops dead. Heart attack, maybe. Mark my words, there'll be no foul play." This statement was met with a muttered snort from behind the lace curtain that divided the bakery from the sitting area. Alice Calthrop stood just out of view, pretending to examine a rack of currant buns. She had barely slept, and her nerves, already delicate, had frayed further at the memory of the stranger's face. She had seen him before. She was almost certain of it, but not here, and not alive. Back at the vicarage, Inspector Darnley was speaking with Reverend Pym in the modest drawing-room that smelled of lavender polish and sermons in progress. The vicar, still pale, had produced a visitor logbook, though it offered little insight. Apart from a delivery from the cathedral press and the occasional visit from the bishop's secretary, no names had been recorded that might match the stranger's appearance. "There's always the back door," Pym murmured. "We leave it open during daylight hours. For prayer and reflection, or for mischief and trespass," Darnley replied. He tapped his notebook with a pencil. No identification. No wallet. No bag. No note. Just that odd little bookmark. The inspector's brow furrowed. "Is it usual," he asked, "for hymnals to be left loose in the sanctuary?" The vicar shook his head. No. They're kept in the cupboard behind the pulpit. Mr. Willers handles all that." Darnley made a note. Meanwhile, at the far end of the village green, Miss Marple was conducting an entirely different sort of inquiry. She was not one for official interviews. Years of quiet observation had taught her that people rarely told the truth under questioning, but they often revealed it during conversation. And so she sat, quite innocently, on the bench beneath the elm tree, a basket of mending in her lap, as she engaged in a casual chat with young Daniel Bray, the postman. Daniel, still red-cheeked from the previous night's fright, was eager to be useful. "I have never seen him before, Miss Marple, not even once, and I know most faces, what with the deliveries and such." "Of course you do," said Miss Marple kindly. "And you say he was just there?" Daniel nodded. "Aye. Kneeling, like in prayer, only he wasn't praying. I thought at first he was waiting for the vicar, but then I saw his face. Not a mark on him, miss. Just still." "You have an excellent memory, Daniel," she said, threading her needle. "Did he seem to be holding the hymnal naturally, or was it perhaps placed there after?" Daniel frowned. "Didn't notice, miss, though. Now you mention it, his hands looked too neat, like he'd been arranged." Miss Marple smiled faintly and snipped a length of thread. "That's very helpful, dear boy. One last thing, did you see anyone leave the church before you entered?" Daniel's brow wrinkled. "Now that's strange. I did think I saw something, a shape, maybe a coat, at the far end, by the organ loft, but it was gone by the time I looked properly." "That is strange," Miss Marple murmured. "Thank you, Daniel." Back at St. Mildred's, the choir cupboard was opened under supervision. Mr. Willers unlocked it with a flourish, clearly relishing the opportunity to demonstrate his vigilance. But inside, there was an anomaly. One hymnal was missing, no record of it being lent or removed. "A mix-up," Mr. Willers insisted. "People borrow them all the time and forget to return them." Miss Marple said nothing. But as she later told her friend Dolly Bantry over tea, one does not forget to return a hymnal containing a hollow bookmark. The police were focusing their attention on practical matters: fingerprinting, door-to-door questioning, and telegraphs to the London authorities. But Miss Marple was focused on something else entirely. Why a church? Why a hymnal? Why a stranger with a hollow bookmark? And why, of all people, had Alice Calthrop gone so terribly pale when the body was found? By evening, gossip had transformed into theories, and theories into conviction. The village had decided it was a foreign spy, or a runaway lover, or a thief who died trying to steal the vicar's silver. Miss Marple, however, sat quietly with her knitting, listening more than she spoke. She noticed things others dismissed: that the bookmark's wood was cedar, not English oak. That Alice had asked, very specifically, whether the man had been holding a black hymnal, and that the local grocer, Mr. March, had closed early for the first time in 6 months, claiming a headache, though he had looked perfectly well that morning. Secrets, Miss Marple knew, were like embroidery threads. You only needed to find the right one to unravel the entire pattern, and this pattern, growing clearer with every interaction, was beginning to look not like a random tragedy, but a deliberate act. Not random at all, just cleverly placed, like a bookmark in a book waiting to be opened. The morning after the discovery at St. Mildred's brought with it a thin veil of mist that hovered over the hedgerows, like a half-formed thought. Birds sang, shutters creaked open, and the gentle machinery of village life.
और आत्मा की तृप्ति नहीं थी। हर दिन वह मन ही मन पूछती, क्या मैं जीवन भर यही करूंगी? और तभी एक दिन ऑफिस जाते समय उसे एक गाड़ी दिखी, जिसका नंबर था 111। अगले दिन खाने के बिल पर वही अंक, फिर फोन पर समय 11:11। ये क्रम कई दिनों तक चलता रहा। पूजा ने खोजबीन शुरू की और उसे पता चला कि 111 बदलाव शुरुआत और ब्रह्मांड की पुकार का प्रतीक है। उसे लगा जैसे कोई अदृश्य शक्ति उसे पुकार रही है, अब अपनी सच्ची राह चुनो। काफी सोच विचार और तैयारी के बाद उसने अपनी पुरानी नौकरी छोड़ दी और एक मानसिक स्वास्थ्य परामर्श केंद्र शुरू किया। आज न केवल आर्थिक रूप से स्वतंत्र है, बल्कि हर दिन आत्मा से जुड़ी हुई महसूस करती है। और जब भी वह 111 देखती है, वह मुस्कुराकर कहती है, धन्यवाद ब्रह्मांड, मुझे जगह देने के लिए। अब सोचिए, क्या आपके साथ भी यही हो सकता है? क्या आपके भीतर भी कोई सपना है जो बहुत समय से दबा हुआ है? क्या आप भी बार बार ये सोचते हैं कि काश कुछ नया शुरू कर पाता? तो यह कोई संयोग नहीं कि आप आज यह वीडियो देख रहे हैं, और शायद आपने भी हाल ही में 111 देखा हो। अब समय है डोर ऑफ पॉसिबिलिटी, अर्थात संभावनाओं के द्वार को खोलने का। अब मैं आपको एक छोटी सी कल्पना यात्रा करवाने जा रहा हूं, जिसे आप अपनी आंखें बंद करके सुने। सांस लें, गहरी सांस, और कल्पना करें आप एक शांत जंगल के बीच हैं। आपके सामने एक सुनहरा,
Like I've seen it somewhere before, but I can't remember where. Miss Marple touched her hand with quiet reassurance. Memory is a peculiar thing. It often reveals the truth at the most inconvenient hour. At that moment, Mr. March, the grocer, had entered the library. He didn't see them. He seemed flustered and distracted, moving past to the reference section where he quickly flipped through an atlas before making a note and hurrying out again. Alice stared after him. "He's never come in here before?" she said. "Said libraries gave him headaches." Miss Marple nodded. "And yet he appears quite willing to endure one today." That afternoon, Inspector Darnley convened a small meeting in the church vestry with Reverend Pym, Miss Marple, and Sergeant Wilkes. A preliminary report had come back from London. The man's fingerprints yielded nothing in their records. No match, no criminal past, no name. Miss Marple asked if they'd checked for signs of foreign origin. "Not conclusively," Darnley admitted. "The ring is being examined by a specialist. No passport, no wallet. The only peculiar object was that bookmark, and the fact that the hymnal it came from is missing." Reverend Pym looked distressed. "It's sacrilege, really. To die in a house of God is one thing, but to steal from it—" "There's also this," said Sergeant Wilkes, pulling something from an envelope. It was tucked beneath the kneeling cushion behind the pulpit. "We nearly missed it." It was a torn scrap of parchment, worn at the edges, folded twice. On it were 3 lines of script, handwritten in faded ink. "Blessed are those who seek without asking, for answers lie not in sound, but in silence. The hollow holds what the heart cannot." Darnley frowned. "Some religious gibberish." "Or a message," Miss Marple said thoughtfully. "A coded one." The inspector looked skeptical. "A riddle," she nodded. "A very precise one." By evening, the village had reached a new level of fevered speculation. Theories now ranged from a secret society of bibliophiles to a long-lost heir returning to reclaim a fortune. Meanwhile, Miss Marple sat quietly in her drawing-room, knitting once more, her mind not on the scarf in her lap, but on the faint discoloration around Alice Calthrop's wrist, the mark of something once worn and recently removed. What had it been, and what might it signify? She rose and went to her writing desk, penning a brief note to Dolly Bantry. Not about the mystery itself, but about the peculiar composition of cedarwood when hollowed, and how such objects were often used to conceal more than just place markers. She had begun to suspect that the bookmark was not simply a hiding place. It was a message. And the hymnal, not just a random book, but a specific vessel chosen with purpose. The dead man's identity was still unknown, but Miss Marple felt certain now of one thing. Whoever he was, he had come to Dibley-Wick to meet someone, and that someone had made certain the meeting ended in silence. The dawn that followed was unusually still, as though the entire village of Dibley-Wick held its breath. Miss Marple, who rose with the sparrows, sat in her parlour with a fresh pot of Ceylon tea beside her and her knitting in her lap. The scarf had grown lopsided, her mind, as usual, far too occupied with murder to keep the stitch count even. Outside, the milk cart rattled along Church Lane, and a dog barked twice, then fell silent. It was the sort of morning that demanded careful thought, and Miss Marple, never one to rush her conclusions, had much to consider. The scrap of parchment found beneath the pulpit had not left her thoughts. The peculiar phrasing, its talk of silence and hollow things, had the unmistakable air of a riddle. But more importantly, it had the unmistakable air of intention. This was not some poetic nonsense left behind by a dreamer. It was purposeful, and to Miss Marple, purpose always pointed to motive. She set aside the scarf, jotted a few notes in the margin of her gardening almanac. She found mystery better dissected among mundane distractions, and slipped on her hat. A visit to Alice Calthrop would do. Not because she suspected the girl, but because Alice had noticed something and, more critically, failed to notice what she had noticed. Alice's cottage was a small ivy-draped structure tucked behind the vicarage. She was in the garden when Miss Marple arrived, pruning a stubborn rose bush that looked as though it had lost the will to bloom. "Good morning, Miss Marple," Alice said, brushing petals from her apron. "You're up early." "One always should be," Miss Marple replied with her customary smile. "The world reveals itself more honestly before the village has fully stirred. May I sit?" Alice nodded, leading her guest to a wooden bench under a pear tree. For a moment they spoke of the weather, of blight on the gooseberry bushes, and of the strange green fly appearing early this season. Then Miss Marple tilted her head. "I've been thinking," she said softly, "about your recollection, the face of the man seeming familiar to you. Might it be something you've seen in a photograph?" Alice blinked. "Perhaps in the parish hall. We do keep a board of visiting choirs and speakers and a few photographs. I suppose it's possible. Would you mind terribly if we had a look?" Together they walked to the parish hall, its dusty windows catching the morning sun. Inside, the walls bore notices from last year's harvest festival and a fading sign for the upcoming spring fete. At the far end hung the community board, yellowed clippings, thank you cards, and a small collection of black and white photographs in curled frames. Alice examined them slowly. Her hand paused on one image, a choir from Cambridge, taken 2 years prior. A man in the back row, partialis, obscured by the choir master's shoulder, bore a vague resemblance to the deceased. "That might be him," she whispered. "But I can't be sure." Miss Marple studied the photograph closely. The man in question wore a dark coat and a small pin on his lapel, something that resembled a lyre or harp. But what drew her attention more was his posture. Not deferential like most of the others, but alert. Watchful. He did not look like a man there to sing. He looked like a man keeping watch. They returned to the vicarage just as Inspector Darnley was exiting, his notebook in hand and his mood evidently sour. "We've had another development," he muttered, tipping his hat to Miss Marple. "Not a good one." "Oh dear," Miss Marple said gently. "Something troubling?" Darnley exhaled sharply. "Reverend Pym just remembered something rather odd. Said a gentleman had come to see him last week, inquiring about a certain hymnal. Said it was a rare edition. Insisted he needed to examine it." Miss Marple's eyes brightened. "And did the Reverend permit it?" "He did, foolishly," Darnley said. "Said the man seemed scholarly enough. Quiet, polite, foreign possibly. Wore gloves. Reverend Pym didn't think twice until I mentioned the missing hymnal." "So he may have taken it then," Miss Marple said. "Or copied something from it," Darnley mused. "Either way, it means our dead man had been here before." This admission changed the angle of the puzzle considerably. Miss Marple returned home deep in thought. There was something very particular about men who wore gloves indoors and knew how to charm vicars. She had seen it before, most recently in a case involving a stolen will and a very obliging choir director. After a light luncheon of poached eggs and tomato, Miss Marple made her way to the jeweller's on Middle Street. Not to buy, but to ask. Mr. Ellery was polishing a set of cufflinks in the display window when she arrived. "Miss Marple," he greeted cheerfully, "still solving puzzles for the yard?" "Oh, I only dabble," she said modestly. "But I was hoping you might help me. Have you seen a ring such as this before?" She sketched the ring from memory, the heavy band, the oval surface etched with curving lines that resembled Arabic or Persian calligraphy. Ellery squinted. "Looks Eastern, certainly. Possibly Ottoman. It could be a family crest or a merchant's seal. Hard to say without the piece in hand. But I'd wager it's more than ornamental. Rings like that often open compartments or contain tiny inscriptions inside." "Like a cipher?" she asked. He nodded. "Precisely." As she walked back through the village, Miss Marple could feel the pieces tightening, like thread being gently pulled through taut fabric. The ring, the hymnal, the scrap of parchment. All clues, yes. But also something else. Echoes of a conversation long past. By the time the sun dipped below, the hills, casting long shadows across the churchyard, Miss Marple had made up her mind. She would write to Colonel Denholm in Surrey. He had once handled a curious case involving an encoded psalter used to pass military secrets in a German boarding school. There was something military about this, she now believed. The man who had died in the church had not merely stumbled into it, he had entered it with intent, and the person he came to meet had something to lose, something they were willing to kill for. But what? As night fell, Miss Marple lit a single lamp, the glow steady beside her knitting basket. She picked up her needles, her hands moving slowly, almost absently. And in her mind, the voice of the dead man seemed to whisper again from the page, "The hollow holds what the heart cannot." She intended to find out exactly what that was. It was 9:15 the next morning when the post arrived at Miss Marple's cottage, precisely on time as it always was when young Henry Hobbs was on his delivery round. A single envelope, cream-colored and crisply folded, bore the neat, unmistakable hand of Colonel Denholm. Miss Marple wasted no time. She slit the envelope with her letter opener shaped like a miniature saber and unfolded the paper with a practiced gentleness. Denholm's reply was as efficient as ever. "My dear Miss Marple, your description of the ring intrigued me. Ottoman, almost certainly. The script you attempted to sketch appears to be Persian calligraphy, possibly 19th century courtly script. Such rings were often carried by couriers or used by members of trade houses to seal private agreements. One in particular comes to mind, linked to a fellow named Haji Rami, who was once suspected of relaying diplomatic letters through British coastal churches, using codes sewn into religious books. Never proven, of course. Too clever by half. I still have my notes from the ministry if you'd like them." Yours in confidence, Denholm. Miss Marple reread the letter thrice before placing it beside her cup of tea. Persian calligraphy. Trade houses. A spy of sorts, hiding secrets in sacred spaces. There was something darkly poetic in the notion. That same morning, Inspector Darnley was seen pacing outside the churchyard, looking quite like a man who had bitten into a plum and found a stone where flesh should be. Miss Marple, ever tactful, approached with a smile. "Good morning, Inspector. You seem vexed." "Miss Marple," he said, tugging irritably at his mustache. "Vexed doesn't begin to describe it. I've just received word from the coroner. The man died of poisoning, something fast-acting and unusual. Not arsenic, not cyanide. He suspects a rare extract, possibly derived from aconite or belladonna. And we still don't know who he is." "A curious choice for a method," she murmured. "Poison requires proximity or deception." "Yes, and neither's easy when you're unknown in a village. Like this. No one's admitted to speaking with him. Not even a shopkeeper remembers selling him so much as a sandwich." "Then perhaps he brought his own," she said. "Or perhaps he trusted someone enough to accept what they offered." Darnley eyed her. "You think it's someone local?" "I think it's someone clever, and cleverness often comes dressed as the familiar." They strolled together through the churchyard. The spring grass had been trimmed recently, and the rows of headstones stood like solemn teeth. Miss Marple paused before the stone bench near the east wall. "Tell me," she said quietly, "did the man have anything else on him? Something small, something easily overlooked?" Darnley hesitated. There was a slip of paper folded into his coat cuff. Blank, but with faint indentations as though it had once held writing. "We've sent it to London. Would you mind terribly if I saw it? I'll bring it to the station this afternoon." With that promise, she turned and made her way back toward the vicarage. The Reverend Pym had been curiously silent since the discovery, not evasive, but subdued. Miss Marple sensed in him a man battling not with guilt, but with fear. And fear, she knew, made people forgetful. Pym welcomed her into his study, the room still smelling faintly of brass polish and lemon oil. He poured her a cup of weak tea and sat opposite her with his hands folded tightly. "Tell me, Reverend," she said gently, "have you remembered anything else about the man who came to see the hymnal?" He blinked, only that he seemed very tired, not physically, mentally, as though carrying some great burden. Did he mention what precisely he was looking for in the hymnal? Pym shook his head, only that it was a matter of quiet urgency. He wasn't impolite, but he asked if any of the hymnals had unusual markings or marginalia. And did they? One did, as a matter of fact. A faint stamp inside the cover. I hadn't noticed it before. Would you allow me to see it? They crossed to the vestry, where the hymnals were kept in a tall wooden cabinet. Pym retrieved the volume with care and passed it to her. Miss Marple opened it with reverence. On the inside cover, faint but legible, was a circular stamp, a crescent moon around a stylized fountain, surrounded by Arabic script. Her heart gave a small, excited flutter, the same emblem, she was certain, as the one on the man's ring. "Fascinating," she said, running her gloved hand gently over the impression. "Was this stamp present before the man's visit?" "I don't know," Pym admitted. "I rarely inspect the hymnals that closely." "Have any gone missing since?" Pym hesitated. "2 others. Not immediately noticed, of course, but when we did the full count this morning." So now there were 3 books, one missing entirely, one found by the body, and this one with the mark. Miss Marple thanked the Reverend and left, her mind now whirring like a well-oiled clock. At home, she arranged the details in her notebook. 3 hymnals. 1 message. 1 death. A poisoned man who came searching for something, and possibly found it. A seal used for covert communication. A coded parchment left behind. And now, one more detail. The second hymnal, the one found by the body, had not been listed among the church's current collection, meaning it had either been added to the premises or swapped in, which meant someone in the village had wanted it to be found. She recalled Colonel Denholm's mention of Haji Rami's use of encoded psalters. What if the hollow bookmark wasn't merely symbolic, but literal? A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. It was Alice Calthrop again, breathless and pink-cheeked. "Miss Marple, I just remembered something odd from the fete last week. I didn't think anything of it until now." "Do come in," Miss Marple said, ushering her to a seat. Alice took a moment, sipped the tea that was always ready, and continued. "There was a man I saw talking to Mrs. Paget. Not the man from the church, but foreign-looking, tall, with a scar under his chin. Mrs. Paget said he was asking about antique hymnals." "Mrs. Paget, the antiquarian's widow?" "Yes. She donated several books to the parish library after her husband died." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. "And where is Mrs. Paget now?" "She went to visit her sister in Exeter yesterday." Too timely to be a coincidence. Miss Marple looked out the window at the curling wisteria and considered the direction the thread was pulling her. The game was no longer confined to Dibley Wick. It reached beyond, into other villages, other hands. But it had begun here, and if her instincts were correct, another piece was still hidden in plain sight. She smiled faintly, her eyes returning to the emblem in her notebook. A fountain, a seal, a hollow place. And behind it all, someone who knew that secrets best kept are secrets disguised. She would write to Exeter next, and perhaps, just perhaps, visit the church after dusk. There are answers that only come when the village is quiet. By the time twilight had drawn a soft lavender curtain over the rooftops of Dibley Wick, the church stood in a hush even more profound than usual. The occasional scuffle of a sparrow or the creak of the old weather vane was the only sound that dared interrupt the gathering dusk. Miss Marple, wrapped in a modest cloak and wearing the sort of stout shoes suitable for navigating both garden paths and moral quagmires, made her way quietly through the lich gate and toward the vestry door. She had obtained the key from the ever-polite Reverend Pym earlier that day, under the pretext of checking a box of old prayer books for the Women's Guild's upcoming restoration initiative. It wasn't entirely untrue, but neither was it the full story. Miss Marple did not enter the church as one investigating a crime. She entered as one searching for human motives tucked between stone, time, and an English village's veneer of politeness. Inside, the vestry smelled faintly of polish and candle soot. Her footsteps echoed softly as she approached the cabinet where the hymnals were stored. She held in her gloved hand the one marked volume with the stamped emblem, a crescent and fountain encircling Persian calligraphy. It still lay open to the inside cover, as if waiting for further attention. Her fingers ran along the leather binding, pausing as they brushed against a slight seam along the inner spine. She pressed gently. Nothing gave. Curious, she held the hymnal up to the flickering gaslight. The spine was unusually hollow, just wide enough, perhaps, for a rolled parchment or a folded note. But it was empty. Miss Marple placed it down and turned her attention to the cabinet. The back panel had a thin vertical crack. Natural aging, perhaps. But closer inspection revealed faint scuff marks at the base, as if something had been slid behind or removed frequently. She bent down and ran her fingers along the floorboards beneath the cabinet. There, beneath the lowest shelf, was a narrow sliver of loosened wood. She produced a slender penknife from her handbag. With a delicacy few would associate with octogenarians, she worked the edge of the knife under the board. It lifted with a soft creak, revealing a shallow cavity no more than 2 inches deep. Inside lay 3 items: a slender glass vial, stoppered with wax, a small scrap of linen embroidered with the number 214, and a folded note yellowed with age. She examined them each in turn. The vial held a clear liquid with a faint bluish sheen. Certainly not holy water, she thought wryly. Perhaps poison. Perhaps not. Best not to uncork it just yet. The linen intrigued her more. The embroidery was hand-stitched, and the number was precise. A page number, a hotel room, or a cipher key. Then the note. She unfolded it with great care. It contained only a single line written in careful, slanting script. The fountain hides what the voice cannot utter. Miss Marple frowned thoughtfully. The fountain again. Was it metaphorical or literal? Suddenly, a noise from beyond the vestry door caused her to freeze. Footsteps, soft, uncertain, approaching the chapel from the outer corridor. She closed the cavity and restored the floorboard with silent swiftness. Slipping the items into her handbag, she backed away from the cabinet and pretended to be inspecting a hymnal on the nearby shelf. The door creaked open, and a figure entered. To her surprise, it was Alice Calthrop, looking flustered and out of breath. "Miss Marple, I didn't mean to startle you. I thought you might still be here." "Why, dear child, is something the matter?" Alice hesitated, then stepped fully into the room, closing the door behind her. I just came from Mrs. Paget's cottage. Her sister returned early from Exeter. She said Mrs. Paget never arrived." Miss Marple's eyebrows rose. "Oh, and there's more. I found this on the doorstep of the cottage." She handed Miss Marple a piece of paper folded twice. Inside was a note written in a different hand than the one in the hymnal, but no less precise. "You've seen too much. Stop asking questions, or next time it won't be a warning." Miss Marple's lips pressed together. "I'm not easily frightened, Miss Marple," said Alice, trying bravely to sound firm, but this felt real. Miss Marple took her hand gently. "You did the right thing, but now you must be careful. Don't go anywhere alone. Say nothing to anyone else about this. Not yet. Alice nodded, subdued. As Miss Marple walked her home beneath the rising moon, her mind remained on the vial, the embroidered linen, and the increasingly enigmatic figure of Mrs. Paget. Was the elderly widow truly in danger, or already gone? Back at home, Miss Marple lit a lamp and returned to her notebook. Item 1. Vial of unknown liquid, possibly poison or symbolic item. Item 2. Embroidered cloth, number 214. Check the significance. Item 3. Note with cryptic message. The fountain hides what the voice cannot utter. She turned to her reference books, particularly one on coded language in Victorian embroidery, an obscure volume, but one she had kept ever since an incident involving a lace doily in St. Mary Mead. The number 214, she discovered, could refer to the 214th hymn in the Anglican hymnal, Dear Lord and Father of Mankind. A hymn about silence, calm, and inner truth. The line in the note, the fountain hides what the voice cannot utter, could be tied to that. What if there had been messages passed via hymn numbers? That would explain the missing books. Someone had been communicating through those hymnals, perhaps over the years, and the man who died, had he intercepted a message not meant for him? Had he decoded something that exposed a long-standing secret? She suddenly recalled something Mrs. Weatherby had said at the fete when describing the stranger. He asked me the time, 3 times, and each time he seemed to want me to answer differently. It hadn't made sense then, but it did now. What if the numbers were part of a verbal code? Miss Marple now felt the case shift again, as though the veil between village life and the strange, silent conspiracy behind it had grown thinner. A new crime felt dangerously close, and someone in Dibley Wick wanted this puzzle buried deep. But Miss Marple had never been one to walk away from unfinished patterns. Not when they involved human nature, and not when a hollow bookmark, so unassuming, so elegant, had been used to hold a message that someone had once killed to protect. By the next morning, Dibley Wick was aglow in the kind of pale sunshine that made one question whether anything dark could ever truly happen in such a charming village. The fields were damp with dew, and the hedgerows shimmered faintly with spiderwebs stitched with silver threads. But Miss Marple, seated at her kitchen table with a fresh pot of Ceylon and her embroidery untouched beside her, knew better. She had slept only lightly, waking often to rethink the sequence of events. The embroidered linen marked with 214, the vial hidden beneath the vestry floor, the missing hymnals, and the second anonymous note. Something was being communicated, but not only recently. This felt like the tail end of something long and quietly orchestrated. And then, of course, there was Mrs. Paget, or rather, the absence of her. After some consideration, Miss Marple decided not to pay a direct visit to the Paget cottage again. If someone had intercepted Mrs. Paget, or worse, it was possible they would be watching. Instead, she chose another route entirely. By 10 o'clock, she had arranged to have tea with Mrs. Lavinia Hargreaves, widow of the late Colonel Hargreaves, and well known for both her almond shortbread and her gossip. Lavinia's parlor was a neatly arranged trap of floral upholstery and stiff lace doilies, with photographs of uniformed men perched at every angle. She prided herself on remembering details no one else could, or should. "Now, Jane," said Mrs. Hargreaves, pouring the tea with her usual brisk elegance, "you mustn't think me unkind, but I've always thought there was something a little mysterious about Mrs. Paget." "Oh? In what way?" "Well, for starters, she never spoke of her late husband. Always Mr. Paget and Mr. Paget's that, but no photo of the man to be seen. And she's very particular about her comings and goings, always out at odd hours, saying she's off to feed the ducks or to check on the church linens. But no one ever saw her do either." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "And what about visitors?" "None. Until recently, of course. You know about that man, I take it? The one who collapsed during the fete? Yes. Well, I saw him about a week before the fete, walking with her near the post office. He didn't seem like a relative, I'll say that. Too formal. Did they appear to be arguing? Number. Not at all. If anything, she looked frightened. Her face was pale, and she glanced over her shoulder more than once. Miss Marple allowed that to settle in silence, sipping her tea. I don't know why I remember it so vividly, Lavinia added, but I do. He had a habit of fiddling with his cufflinks. Very polished gentleman, but there was something odd in the way he stood. Rigid, like a soldier, but more tense. After some light conversation and a second helping of short bread, Miss Marple thanked her hostess and made her way back toward the village green. Her mind was now buzzing with new connections. That the man had known Mrs. Paget wasn't a revelation, but the nature of their relationship remained murky. Fear, rather than friendliness, had governed their encounter, and the repeated visits to the church under benign excuses now took on a more clandestine tone. Back home, Miss Marple took out the scrap of embroidered linen and placed it beside her copy of the Anglican hymnal. She turned to hymn 214, the same one she had researched the night before. Dear Lord and Father of mankind. But today she noticed something new. In her own copy, the first line read as it always had, Dear Lord and Father of mankind, forgive our foolish ways. But in one of the borrowed copies, the one left in the box from the church, there was a faint smudge beneath the word forgive. A very precise thumbprint, pressed almost deliberately, and beside it, a tiny ink mark in the margin. Not a correction, a guide. She flipped to the back of the hymnal and found another faint mark, this time under the number 392. That hymn was about the voice of the Lord. The connection to the fountain quote, "The fountain hides what the voice cannot utter," came rushing back. These weren't bookmarks. They were keys, a sequence of hymns, numbers, lines. Together, perhaps they formed a message. A code passed between hymnals, hidden in the routine of Sunday worship, and someone had cracked it. Miss Marple went to her writing desk and made a list of all the hymn numbers mentioned so far, 214, 392, 137, and 58, gleaned from the defaced hymnals and subtle notes. Arranging them, she saw a pattern. Each hymn contained a word or line referencing silence, concealment, or water. She then made a second list. Individuals with access to the vestry and the hymnals. Reverend Pym, Mrs. Paget, Alice Calthrop, choir organizer, Mr. Ellis, churchwarden, Nora Bellamy, cleaning staff. She circled Mrs. Paget and Alice. One missing, one being threatened. The two people most likely to have handled the specific books in question. And suddenly, she remembered something else. The young man who died during the fete. He had been seen entering the church the day before. No one had thought it odd. People came and went, and the fete preparations had lent a casual air to everything. But he had come alone, with no clear purpose. What if he hadn't come to attend? What if he came to collect? And what if he had intercepted a message not meant for him? She returned to the glass vial, still untouched on her sideboard. The bluish liquid inside no longer struck her as the first clue. It might be the final one. Was it part of the method of death? A warning? A tool used in the coded exchange? Just then, a knock at the door. Miss Marple, slightly wary, opened it only after peering through the curtain. It was Alice, pale, distressed, and holding something. I found it this morning, she said breathlessly. In my choir folder. It wasn't there before. She held out a small folded paper. Inside was another note. Tonight, at the fountain. No one else. Or she won't be the only one. Alice looked terrified. Miss Marple took the note with care and closed the door gently behind her. Very well, she said quietly. Then tonight we go to the fountain. together. The hour was just past 10 when Miss Marple and Alice Calthrop stepped softly into the churchyard. The night air was crisp, laced with the scent of moss and old stone. A fog had begun to gather low along the cobbles, wrapping itself around the headstones like an old woolen shawl. The fountain, their destination, sat silently in its little alcove of ivy and yew. It had not run in years, but the basin still held water from recent rains, slick with green algae and flecked with fallen petals from the overhanging vine. Miss Marple carried a lantern, its light shielded with a handkerchief to keep their presence discreet. Alice walked slightly behind her, clutching her coat to her chest. She had been quiet since the note was found. Too quiet. Miss Marple had gently questioned her earlier that evening, but Alice had either genuinely known little or was too frightened to share more. They arrived at the edge of the fountain and paused. "No one," Alice whispered. "Yet," Miss Marple corrected. "It's still early. I believe we are meant to wait." The church bell rang for a quarter hour. In the distance, a dog barked once and fell silent again. The village seemed otherwise suspended, like a breath held before something inevitable. Miss Marple studied the fountain closely. The tiled back panel, once a brilliant blue, was now a patchwork of fading color and hairline cracks. And there it was again, the clue etched faintly into the corner tile. She knelt beside it, brushing away some dirt with the corner of her handkerchief. "They've worn down with time," she murmured. "But you can still see the letters, like a private message scratched with a hairpin." Alice glanced around nervously. "Do you think he'll come?" Miss Marple looked up. "He or she most certainly will. This meeting has been arranged with a great deal of risk. The message in your choir folder was not accidental. Someone wanted it to reach you specifically." "Why me?" Alice asked, her voice strained. "I'm not even important." Miss Marple gave her a steady look. "My dear, importance is a strange thing. It isn't always about standing or wealth. Sometimes it's about knowledge, or access, or innocence." Footsteps. Both women turned. From the shadowed arch between the church and the vicarage wall emerged a figure. Tall, covered in a long coat, the hat was pulled low. The figure paused, then stepped into the weak light spilling from Miss Marple's lantern. It was Mr. Ellis, the churchwarden. "Miss Marple," he said with a practiced smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Alice, I must say I'm surprised to find the two of you out so late." Miss Marple straightened, her voice calm. "I should say the same. The churchyard is an odd place for an evening walk, wouldn't you agree?" Ellis chuckled softly. "I could say I'm checking the grounds after the fete, but I suppose that wouldn't satisfy you." "No, it wouldn't," she replied. "Tell me, did you place the note in Alice's folder?" There was a flicker of something in his expression. Then he looked at Alice and said, "I did." Alice stepped back. "Why? What do you want from me?" Ellis's shoulders sagged slightly, as though he'd been carrying the weight of his own deception for too long. "I wanted to protect her," he said to Miss Marple, not Alice, from what was coming. "Coming from whom?" Miss Marple asked, voice soft. Ellis looked around them as though the gravestones might be listening. "There's been something hidden in the vestry for years," he said slowly. "Something buried. Literally. I didn't know about it until I overheard Paget and that man arguing behind the choir stalls. I thought it was blackmail at first, but then I saw him take something from the hollow beneath the floor. A small box. I don't know what was in it. Letters, I think, but whatever it was, it frightened Paget terribly. She said he had no right, that she would tell." "And did she?" Miss Marple asked. "She tried," he said. "She came to me, asked for help, said someone was watching her. And yet you did nothing." "I didn't know what to do," he snapped. "If I went to the police, I'd be dragged into it. And then, 2 days later, that man turns up dead at the fete, and she vanishes. You think that's a coincidence? No, Miss Marple said. I think it's orchestration. Alice, whose face had grown steadily paler, stepped forward. So what happens now? Are we in danger? Alice gave a weak shrug. I don't know, but whoever wanted that box, whatever sent that man, must know there were others aware of its contents. Mrs. Paget, perhaps me. Maybe even you, Alice. There was silence for a moment. Then Miss Marple turned to the fountain and pointed to the tile again. Do you know what this means, Mr. Ellis? He peered at it but shook his head. It's just a mark. Old no, Miss Marple said gently. It's part of a code, a hymn number, a trail cleverly disguised. I believe Mrs. Paget and her late husband may have been involved in passing information, perhaps during the war, and I think it continued long after. Someone discovered the system and tried to retrieve the past for their own ends. Ellis stared at her. You mean espionage? Or its messy, lingering remains, Miss Marple said. Codes hidden in hymnals, rendezvous arranged under the guise of parish work. It would explain why no one saw her doing what she claimed. Because she wasn't feeding ducks or ironing linens. She was meeting someone. Exchanging something. Alice's voice trembled. But why me? Why would they think I knew anything? Miss Marple looked at her kindly. Because you carry the folders, you handle the hymnals, you are invisible to those who think only in terms of threats. That makes you valuable. And vulnerable. A sudden noise broke the moment. A shuffle of gravel. They all turned. A second figure was running from the rear of the church. Without thinking, Mr. Ellis gave chase, darting after the shadow disappearing behind the vestry. Alice gasped and clutched Miss Marple's arm. Miss Marple, steady as ever, said only, Come. We mustn't delay. They hurried after Ellis, who was already rounding the corner. But by the time they reached the far side of the church, the figure had vanished, leaving only the scent of crushed lavender and a scrap of torn black cloth snagged on the low fence. Ellis was breathing hard. He got away. Yes, Miss Marple said, but not without giving us something. That cloth is new. Expensive. Someone who doesn't belong here. Someone who thinks their footprints vanish in fog. She turned the scrap over in her gloved hand and gave a small, knowing smile. They always forget the village remembers what they do not. Alice looked at her, confused. Miss Marple tucked the cloth into her bag. Let's go home. Tomorrow, I believe, the final piece will present itself. Alice frowned. How can you be so certain? Miss Marple's smile deepened. Because the last move is always the most desperate, and our opponent has just made theirs. The morning broke pale and brittle, sunlight filtering through the gauze of low clouds that hung over St. Mildred's like an anxious thought. Miss Marple stirred her tea with thoughtful precision, the gentle clink of spoon against china the only sound in her parlor, aside from the occasional chirrup of a distant bird. She had not slept long, nor deeply, but her mind had worked with relentless steadiness through the quiet hours. Outside, the village went about its routines with a kind of brittle cheer. News of Mrs. Paget's disappearance had spread, though not by official word, but through whispers and hurried conversations over fences and bakery counters. Some insisted she had merely left in distress. Others, with growing unease, dared to use darker terms. Miss Marple set down her cup and reached for her gloves. It was time to pay another visit to the church, this time not with the hope of an ambush in the shadows, but with the aim of revisiting what the eye had missed and the heart had feared to consider. She arrived to find the Reverend Sims rearranging hymnals in a distracted manner, muttering about misplaced choir lists. He looked up with visible relief at her arrival. Miss Marple, thank heavens. I suppose I am at a bit of a loss. Things are going missing. Small things, yes, but troubling all the same. Choir notes. The vestry key. One of the altar cloths. She nodded. Disorder often precedes revelation, Reverend. He blinked. Pardon? Miss Marple smiled gently. You mentioned the vestry key. Do you suppose it might have been intentionally taken? He considered her. You suspect someone has been searching? Let's not leap to such aggressive terminology. Let us say, recovering. Together they walked through the nave, past the polished pews and the intricately carved rood screen until they reached the vestry door. Reverend Sims patted his pockets with growing frustration until Miss Marple, ever prepared, produced the spare key from her handbag. Mr. Ellis lent it to me, she explained, noting Sims's startled expression. Inside the vestry, dust motes danced in the shafts of light that spilled through the stained glass window. Miss Marple moved slowly, methodically, glancing at each shelf and cabinet not with suspicion, but with curiosity. Has this chest always been here? She asked, pointing to a narrow, time-darkened cabinet tucked behind a rack of old vestments. Sims frowned. That? I suppose it must have been. It came from the rectory storage years ago. Old Mrs. Fenwick said it was used for storing ceremonial records. Miss Marple examined the latch. It was locked, but the wood was splintered near the catch. Not freshly broken, but worn, as though someone had repeatedly tried to force it and then abandoned the effort. Would you permit me to? Before Sims could answer, she drew out a small brass key from her reticule, one she had taken from the drawer of the churchwarden's desk the night before. She inserted it. It fits. Inside, wrapped in faded blue tissue, was a hollowed-out hymnal. The edges had been carefully sliced, the inside cut away to form a cavity. And within that cavity, tied with red string, were a number of items. A folded letter, brittle with age, a photograph, a bundle of typed pages, creased and speckled with watermark, and finally, a tiny notebook bound in soft calfskin. Miss Marple examined each in silence, her expression unreadable. At length, she closed the cabinet and turned back to Sims. This, she said, is the missing center of the web. Mrs. Paget's husband, as it turns out, kept very meticulous records. These documents date back over 20 years. References to quiet transactions, to coded entries in parish accounts, and to at least one meeting at the British Museum that would not have interested any choir member. Reverend Sims gaped. Espionage? Miss Marple nodded slightly. During the war, some villages became conduits for information. St. Mildred's, it seems, was one such place. Your church's serene exterior belied a rather more turbulent interior life. But why now? He asked. Why has this all come to the surface again? Because someone believed the past was buried too deeply to ever resurface. But Mrs. Paget remembered. And when that man, let us call him the visitor, arrived at the fete, he wasn't seeking friendship or charity. He was retrieving something or silencing someone. There was a knock at the vestry door. Reverend Sims opened it to reveal Inspector Cray, looking worn and skeptical. Miss Marple. Reverend, I hear you found something. She gestured to the documents. Indeed, and I suggest you read them with care. They explained more than anyone expected. Cray rifled through the notebook, whistling low. Names, dates, meetings. Good Lord. Carefully coded, Miss Marple said, but not beyond deduction. He looked up. What about Mrs. Paget? Miss Marple's expression softened. I believe she is still alive, hidden perhaps by someone who thought they were protecting her or silencing her. Either way, it's time we searched properly. Cray nodded. And the man in black? We nearly caught him last night, she said. He'll grow desperate. He'll return. She turned to Sims. You must cancel tomorrow's choir rehearsal. He blinked. Why? Because we are going to set a stage, one he cannot resist entering. Back in her cottage that afternoon, Miss Marple prepared a fresh pot of tea. She laid out the papers in neat piles, adding her own notes in the margins, occasionally pausing to underline a date or cross-reference an entry with a newspaper clipping she had retrieved from her sideboard. Outside, the wind stirred the garden, shaking the hollyhocks and setting the bird bath trembling. She glanced up at the small bookshelf near her fire. One hymnal stood out slightly further than the rest, one she had removed and studied the night before. She rose, took it down, and opened it. Inside was a slip of paper, pressed so tightly into the spine that it had nearly vanished. It bore only a line of music, 3 notes, and the initials R.C. She sat back and smiled. The last note in a song no one else knew was playing, she murmured. The bells of St. Mildred's rang at 3:30, clear and measured, though no rehearsal was scheduled for that afternoon. The sound carried down the lane to Miss Marple's cottage, where the old lady, seated in her garden with a light shawl about her shoulders, counted each toll with thoughtful precision. She noted the absence of hurrying footsteps from choir members and the peculiar stillness that settled over the churchyard, as though the building itself were holding its breath. Inside the nave, a subtle tension rippled through the stained glass and stone. Reverend Sims had complied with her request. No choir practice today. Instead, the vestry was being quietly watched, and a certain page from the recovered notebook had been left visible on the open altar lectern. A list of dates and ciphered locations, innocuous to the untrained eye, but bait to someone seeking to retrieve what they feared might still be found. Miss Marple rose slowly from her chair and made her way toward the church. She was unhurried, but her step was sure. She had spent the morning reviewing the contents of the notebook and the intercepted letter, now secured with Inspector Cray. What emerged was not merely a record of espionage during the war, but something more contemporary, an account of pressure and blackmail that had continued in some form into the present. The initials R.C. matched a forgotten entry in the parish register. Richard Crawley, briefly employed as a church secretary in 1943, dismissed for reasons unrecorded. He had vanished shortly thereafter. Yet the letter in the hollow bookmark mentioned an R.C., arriving soon after the war ended, desperate for funds and wielding knowledge that others had reason to suppress. Miss Marple passed the lich gate and entered the cool hush of the church. Inspector Cray waited inside, behind the rood screen, with a constable stationed discreetly by the south transept. The Reverend had agreed to remain visible in the vestry, pretending to sort hymnals again, giving the illusion of routine, though the atmosphere was anything but. "Thank you for coming, Miss Marple," Cray said softly as she approached. "We've kept the church doors open, as you suggested. If he's watching, he'll believe this is his last chance to retrieve the evidence. And to silence the threat it represents," she added. The two stood in silence for a moment, eyes scanning the pews. The only sound was the occasional creak of wood settling and the distant chirp of a sparrow trapped in the clerestory. Then, footsteps, slow, deliberate, and entirely out of step with the usual rhythm of a visitor. They echoed softly on the flagstones, drawing closer to the lectern. Cray tensed. Miss Marple touched his sleeve gently. "Not yet." A figure emerged, a man in his late 50s, neatly dressed, with a flat cap and walking stick. He paused at the lectern and examined the open page. His face betrayed nothing, but his fingers trembled slightly as he reached for the notebook. "Now," she whispered. Cray stepped forward. "Sir, may I have a word with you?" The man turned, startled. "I beg your pardon." "You were here 2 nights ago, just after dusk. You entered through the side chapel, left footprints in the organ loft, and exited over the east wall. We have your prints. More importantly, we have your face, caught by the vicarage's weather camera." The man hesitated. His walking stick clicked once against the floor before he dropped it and bolted toward the aisle. But he didn't get far. The constable emerged from the transept and intercepted him neatly, bringing him down with minimal force. As the scuffle quieted, Miss Marple stepped forward. "You're not Richard Crawley," she said calmly, "but you knew him, perhaps even worked with him." The man glared at her. I don't know what you're talking about. But you do, she replied. Your interest in that particular hymnal, your late-night search of the vestry, and your attempts to reach Mrs. Paget before she disappeared, they all suggest a connection. You feared she might expose your involvement, and when the fate brought too many eyes to the church, you panicked. Cray nodded to his men, who took the man away. The church slowly exhaled, the air easing its tension as footsteps receded down the stone path. Later, in the vicarage drawing-room, Miss Marple sat with Cray and Reverend Sims over tea. You were right, of course, Cray said. The man we apprehended was Geoffrey Finch, a former ministry clerk with a rather spotty record. He worked with Crawley during the war. When Crawley vanished, Finch continued their operation. Small-scale blackmail, occasional forgeries. Nothing so dramatic until Mrs. Paget, unknowingly, unearthed part of their history. Sims looked pale. And Mrs. Paget herself? Cray offered a faint smile. Found this morning, hiding at a cousin's in Tunbridge Wells. She feared she might be blamed for the break-in or worse. Remembered enough from her husband's old files to realize the danger, but not enough to piece it all together. She'll return tomorrow. And the notebook? Miss Marple asked. With the Home Office. They'll pick apart every code, but they'll be lucky to find anything your mind didn't already untangle. She offered him a modest smile. One does what one can. Though I fear we've left the church with rather a lack of choir members, haven't we? Sims chuckled weakly. 2 moved to Bath, one now under investigation, and another refuses to sing in a room she believes is cursed. People always find reasons to be afraid, Miss Marple said gently, folding her hands. But more often than not, it's fear itself that blinds them, not the things they fear. Cray rose. Thank you, Miss Marple. Once again, your quiet deductions have done what Scotland Yard could not. She watched him go, then turned her gaze to the window where rain had begun to fall. The garden blurred, and a blackbird darted beneath a hedge. She reached into her knitting basket, removed a soft wool skein, and began to cast on a new row. Outside, the storm would pass, and inside, order had been restored, quietly, thoroughly, and with the certainty of one who understood the nature of both books and people. The rain had returned to St. Aldhelm, a thin, persistent drizzle that misted the hedgerows and sent villagers scurrying under umbrellas and oilskin hats. The damp, as Miss Marple would have noted, had a way of softening the world's edges and loosening tongues that might otherwise stay politely buttoned. That afternoon, the library was a little busier than usual. Mrs. Trowbridge, the part-time librarian and lifelong gossip, bustled about replacing returned volumes while casting sidelong glances at anyone who lingered too long in the crime-fiction aisle. Miss Marple, however, had taken her usual spot by the window, a position affording both good lighting for her knitting and an excellent view of the reading tables. She wasn't knitting, though. Not today. Today, she was reading between the lines, watching as Harold Litchfield, the estate agent's son, pretended to browse regional almanacs while clearly stealing furtive glances at the reference desk. Miss Marple had noticed the boy before. He had been one of the volunteers for the Fettes choir stall, and his sudden awkwardness around anyone from the church circle had not escaped her. The old clock struck 3, and with it came a rustle of movement. Miss Marple saw Mrs. Amelia Danforth arrive, wearing her usual pearl brooch and carrying a folded umbrella despite the indoor setting. She offered a polite smile to Harold, who immediately busied himself with a thick volume on land records. Amelia, for her part, made her way to the local history section. A curious choice, Miss Marple thought, for a woman who had once declared historical reading as dry as a bad sponge cake. Something in the air shifted. The careful choreography of avoidance, of accidental meetings that were not quite accidental, of glances too subtle for most to detect. Miss Marple saw it all. She rose quietly and moved to the bookshelf just behind Harold, appearing to examine a book on hedge laying. She did not look directly at him. but she spoke softly. "Young Mr. Litchfield," she said in her customary warm tone. "Do you know, I often find that old maps conceal as much as they reveal." Harold turned, startled. "Miss Marple, I didn't see you there." She smiled. "That's the trouble with libraries. One becomes quite invisible, especially to those pretending to read." He flushed, the pink crawling up to his hairline. "I was just researching the old mill property. My father's taking over its listing." "Indeed," Miss Marple replied gently, "though I believe that parcel hasn't been in public exchange since 1923. A curious time to relist it, wouldn't you say?" Harold looked flustered. Well, I'm not sure of the details. I was only told to gather history for the documentation." Miss Marple offered a nod, then stepped away, not pressing him further. Instead, she walked past Amelia Danforth, now deep in a book she appeared not to be reading at all. Miss Marple did not speak to her. Instead, she exited the library and made her way through the misting rain to the Green Finch, the local tea shop. Inside, the scent of cinnamon scones and overbrewed tea hung in the air like a memory. Miss Marple was expected. Her usual table had already been set with a clean lace doily and her preferred Earl Grey. She nodded politely at the young waitress, then withdrew from her handbag the folded piece of parchment she had copied from the hollow bookmark. She no longer needed the original. The peculiar phrasing, the stilted Latin abbreviations, and the seemingly innocuous dates. It had taken her some time, but now the pattern was beginning to emerge. She compared the note with an old church program she had tucked beside it. Each date in the message matched a corresponding passage from the village archives, which Miss Marple had discreetly reviewed with the librarian's help 2 days prior. Property records, ownership disputes, shifts in land boundaries. And then it struck her, as clearly as a bell tolling across the square. The code was not a confession, it was a timeline, a breadcrumb trail through real estate transactions and forged bequests. Someone had been rearranging the village itself, one silent paper, shuffle at a time. As she sipped her tea, she thought of Reverend Sims with his distracted stammering and his insistence that the church's records had recently been misfiled. She recalled the way Mrs. Danforth's fingers trembled when folding her umbrella, and how Harold had avoided mentioning the name Crofton altogether, despite it being scrawled in the margins of the book he held. She didn't yet know the full shape of it, but the hollow bookmark, once thought a curiosity, now appeared to be a signal, not a souvenir from the fete, but a warning from someone who had begun to understand the truth, and paid dearly for it. At that moment, the bell over the tea shop's door jingled, and in walked Inspector Graves, shaking water from his coat like a dog. He spotted Miss Marple and approached with something between relief and exasperation. "Miss Marple," he said, removing his cap, "I don't suppose you've heard. Mrs. Danforth was just brought in for questioning. It seems someone saw her near the church offices the night before Mrs. Paget's disappearance." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled as she folded her napkin. "Oh, Inspector," she said mildly. "I dare say I've heard a great many things." "And do you think she's guilty?" he asked. Miss Marple rose slowly, reaching for her umbrella. "I think," she said, "that the truth is often like a faint watermark beneath ordinary paper. It is always there, but only visible to those who know where to hold it to the light." With that, she stepped out into the soft rain, the puzzle pieces clicking ever closer together in her mind. There remained one final piece. One confrontation is yet to come, and Miss Marple, quiet and unassuming, was already preparing for it. The sun rose pale and uncertain over St. Aldhelm, as though reluctant to cast full light on the events of the previous days. The village square was quiet, save for the intermittent clip of hooves pulling the milk cart and the rattle of shutters being unlatched. But in the parlor of a modest brick house just opposite the churchyard, a final scene was about to unfold, one with more consequence than the gossip to follow could ever hope to capture. Miss Marple had invited a small assembly to her home that morning, offering each guest the vague pretext of discussing the upcoming church restoration fund. In truth, the purpose was far more delicate. Around the small tea table sat Inspector Graves, Mrs. Amelia Danforth, young Harold Litchfield, and to everyone's surprise, the quiet and stoop-shouldered Reverend Sims. The vicar appeared visibly uneasy, fidgeting with his cassock sleeve and refusing even the comfort of a biscuit. Miss Marple, serene as ever, poured tea with practiced grace. "Milk, Reverend?" she asked kindly. "Or lemon?" "Neither, thank you," he murmured, barely meeting her eyes. The silence that followed was thick. Inspector Graves broke it with a nudge of his notebook. "Well, Miss Marple, I believe you have something to say to us all." She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she took a small folded document from her handbag and placed it gently on the table. The parchment was fragile, yellowed with age, and bore the faded ink of legal authority. "This," she said softly, "is a copy of a property deed, drawn in 1918, just after the conclusion of the Great War. It pertains to a plot of land near the church, which was quietly acquired under the name of one Archibald Crofton." Harold Litchfield's face went white. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. "The Crofton family," Miss Marple continued, "has not been heard of in St. Aldhelm for decades. Most believed they had no remaining heirs. But that was not quite true, was it, Mr. Litchfield?" Harold's voice was barely audible. "My grandmother was a Crofton. My father changed the name before I was born. I didn't think it mattered." "Oh, but it did," Miss Marple said gently. "You see, the Croftons were swindled out of several properties after the war. The records, which had conveniently vanished from the church's archives, would have proven it. I found the missing inventory pages just yesterday behind a loose panel in the choir loft." She turned to Reverend Sims. "You told me those records were simply misfiled. But you were covering for someone, weren't you?" Sims flushed. "It was Amelia," he confessed. "She said it would be disastrous if old claims were revived. The village couldn't afford another scandal. I believed her." Miss Marple nodded. "Mrs. Danforth has long been the de facto guardian of the church's legacy. But she took that guardianship too far. She intercepted the letter hidden inside the hollow bookmark, the one Mrs. Paget had copied before her disappearance. It detailed the land dispute, along with the quiet pressure she had been under to drop the matter." Inspector Graves sat forward. "Are you saying Mrs. Danforth threatened Mrs. Paget?" "No," said Miss Marple. "That would be far too vulgar for someone of Mrs. Danforth's refinement. Instead, she used implication and fear. Subtle suggestions that a scandal might harm the church, the village, and even Mrs. Paget's late husband's memory. It was enough to drive a woman like Agnes Paget, already reclusive, into silence. But then the fate arrived, and with it the choir program, and something in that night stirred her resolve. She picked up the bookmark once more. She hid this during the event, perhaps hoping someone would find it. She couldn't confront them directly, but she hoped the truth might rise on its own. Harold's voice trembled. But why did she disappear? Miss Marple regarded him with deep sympathy. Because she feared retaliation, and rightly so. That same night, someone entered her cottage. Not to harm her, but to retrieve the original letter. Mrs. Paget escaped before they arrived. She's been staying quietly at her cousin's home in Little Comberton ever since. She contacted me yesterday. Inspector Graves let out a low whistle. "Well, she's alive." "Yes," said Miss Marple, "and she'll be returning this afternoon under police protection. She's ready to testify." Mrs. Danforth finally spoke, her voice crisp. "It was never about greed, Miss Marple. You don't understand. If those claims went public, it would have cast doubt on decades of community decisions, endowments, property sales, even marriages based on land arrangements. The village's sense of order would have collapsed." Miss Marple sipped her tea thoughtfully. I do understand, Mrs. Danforth. But truth, however inconvenient, is not something one gets to choose. It either is, or it is not. The room fell quiet again. Graves rose and placed a hand on Mrs. Danforth's shoulder. "You're not under arrest," he said slowly, "but we'll need a full statement, and there will be consequences." Miss Marple stood and walked over to the mantel, gazing at a small framed photo of the church choir from 3 years ago. She spoke softly, as though to herself. "It's often said that villages like ours are peaceful, but I think what they are is delicate. A bit of truth out of place, and the whole tapestry can unravel." Then she turned back, her expression serene once more. "But with careful mending, Reverend, even an unraveled tapestry can be restored." Outside, the drizzle had finally stopped, and the cobblestones shone faintly in the morning light. Miss Marple offered each guest a final cup of tea and quietly returned the bookmark to her handbag. The puzzle had been solved, not through confrontation or force, but through attention, observation, and a quiet refusal to let the truth remain buried. And as the villagers would whisper in the days to come, no one had truly noticed Miss Marple at first. She was, after all, just a sweet old lady with a teacup and a talent for seeing what others would rather keep hidden.